We're in John chapter 11. For those of you who have not been with us, what we're doing is we're watching the plan of God, the plan of Jesus unfold. And it doesn't often seem like that when we're talking about a story where a guy dies. But what we're watching is the plan of God being orchestrated perfectly in human history. We're watching glory come to the Father, glory come to the Son, and the way that glory is coming to the Father and the Son is through people's belief in the sign that they're about to see. We're going to cover that next week. The same glory that can be brought to the Father and the Son when this story happened in people's belief, it's the same glory that we give to God today. When we read this story and we think to ourselves, if this guy raised someone from the dead, then I have to figure out what to do with that. And when you and I choose to believe the sign, then we glorify God in the same way that the people had the opportunity to do when Jesus was walking on the earth. So think about that as we're going through this. At the point in the story we are, John chapter 11, we left off last week in verse 30, but we'll go back to the beginning of the section in verse 28. We saw, Steve mentioned it a couple weeks ago. Then Ali mentioned it last week, that in the story of Martha and Mary coming to Jesus, they come to Jesus at the front end the very same way. Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And their response is the same on the front end. But what happens right after they say that to Jesus when they approach him is two very different things. We heard Steve talk about 2 weeks ago, Martha, the thinker. She's the mental one. She's the one who comes with questions. It's not my brother's died and I come with emotion. That's Mary. That's what we're going to look at today. But Martha's the thinker. She comes to Jesus saying, how do I make sense of this? And in the midst of pain, in the midst of suffering, she comes to Jesus asking, how do I make sense of this? And he gives her in that moment a profound truth. I am the resurrection and the life. And so in the midst of her suffering, as she's trying to make sense of it all mentally, trying to grasp what's happening, Jesus provides for her in that way. Profound truth. And then she's given the opportunity to believe. He asked her specifically, do you believe that I am the resurrection and the life? That when you believe in me, although you die, you will live. It's the truth that she gets the choice to believe or not to believe. What we're looking at today in this story is Mary, her sister, coming to Jesus. And Mary's the feeler. How many of you are the feeler? Who's the feeler? Okay, there's a few husbands that are like, you're the feeler. There's a few wives that are like, you're the feeler. That's what my wife would be doing. Mary's the feeler. She's the pathos. She's the emotion. She's the one who comes to Jesus, and she doesn't care if it all makes sense. She's just broken, overwhelmed with emotion. It's what we're going to see in the story today. Here's the reason why Steve set us up 2 weeks ago, and then why I told Ali at the 9:30 service last week that he set me up perfectly, because he spent about 2-3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes, talking about how these two things are contrasted in this story. How Jesus ministers to Martha in her time of trying to figure things out and understand because she's the thinker. And then he turns right around and goes to Mary and ministers to her in a completely different way. And he just walks one person after the next through pain and tragedy and suffering, and we get to see them back to back. So what we're going to look at today and focus on is the story of Mary and Jesus' response to her. What I want you to do is I want you to watch how Jesus so perfectly responds to each person exactly how they need it. I want you to see how he responds to one and then turns around and responds to the other. Not the same way, not blanketed. This is how you deal with suffering. Oh, you've died. I've seen someone die before. This is how you walk through it. No. Tailors how he ministers to people based on what they need. I want you to see how God can do that for you. And I want you to see how we then as Christians should turn around and be flexible to care for people when they're suffering in the way that they need it, so that we can learn that God does it first for us, and then we turn and do it for others. So that's what we're looking at. So John chapter 11, start in verse 28. That's the beginning of this section, when Martha goes and calls Mary. So verse 28, When she said this is Martha speaking. When she said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, that is Mary, she got up quickly and was coming to Jesus. Now, Martha calls on behalf of Jesus, and then Mary goes outside of Bethany to meet where Jesus is. He hasn't come into the city yet. So, verse 30. Now, Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. Now, I want you to see how God is orchestrating these things. Because although it's right what Ali said last week, that Jesus wanted a private meeting with Mary. Jesus was calling her out to have a private conversation with Mary. That's absolutely true. And in the midst of doing that, he's also orchestrating a plan where he's about to raise somebody from the dead in front of a whole crowd. Because what he knows is that Mary's going to come out, have this private conversation with him, and as she comes out of the house, she's going to bring everybody with her. Because the people are going to think that she's going to mourn, and the mourners, the family members, are going to follow her. And so Jesus is going to attract a crowd. After he has this private conversation with Mary, he's going to then do this miracle in front of a crowd, not just in front of her. Verse 31. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. 2 weeks ago, Steve kind of broke this down for you guys. It's customary to wrap the body the day of, if possible, of the person who is dead. Here's the reason why. Because in Jewish law, dead things make everything unclean. You can't cook a meal in your home if there's a dead person in your home. So they got to get the person out, wrap them up, put them in the tomb so that they can go back. And normally people at that point would come and they'd eat a meal with you. But they can't cook in their home until they remove the dead person because it makes everything unclean. So if possible, before sundown, wrap the body up, put it in the tomb, same day. Then they would spend 1 week of mourning together, weeping, visiting the tomb. Family would come, they would stay with them, and they would do this for a whole week. And then maybe some family would leave and some family would stay, and there'd be a month-long process after that of lesser mourning, but still remembering the dead, a whole month-long process. And then after that, a 1-year anniversary, they would go to the tomb, they'd open the tomb, roll back the stone, they'd go inside, collect the bones, take them out, put them in a box, bury the box, and they'd have a whole nother ceremony again. I got to be honest. 2 weeks ago, preparing for this, and then having gone to the funeral that I went to a week and a half ago, and then this past week, going to another funeral of one of my wife's friends, family members, I got to admit that this process of mourning seems a whole lot more effective than our show up for an hour or 2 hours and then go home and pretend like everything's okay. I don't know about you, but I don't believe that American culture has everything right all the time. We do a lot of good things. But sometimes I look to other people and the way they do things, and I think to myself, man, isn't that more reflective of how painful death is? Just seems like it to me. So I, in some ways, envy their customs and how they would recognize how painful and how difficult a 1-year anniversary can be after you've lost someone that you love. Notice how Mary comes to Jesus here, verse 32. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him. She fell at his feet, saying, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." This is the part where she repeats the same thing that her sister has repeated. But notice the difference in her posture. Verse 33. When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and was troubled. So Martha comes to Jesus, and she says, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And then the logic sets in. Back in verse 21, 22. She says, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give it to you." So she's trying to make sense of everything mentally. She comes to God, she's like, I know if you had been here, remember that Steve said 2 weeks ago that probably Lazarus died while the courier was going to Jesus. By the time we get to next week, Martha's going to say to Jesus, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. But you remember that Jesus only stayed 2 days where he was. And it wasn't more than a day to get from where he was on the other side of the Jordan to Bethany. Which means probably after they sent word that Lazarus was sick, sometime between when the courier got left and got to Jesus, Lazarus is probably already dead. And they probably knew that. So when Jesus comes, they say to him, if you had been here, maybe not a blaming Jesus, like, man, if you didn't wait 2 days, but maybe just realizing that, man, we didn't send early enough. And if we had sent to you early enough and it had gotten to you and you had come, our brother wouldn't have died. But she approaches Jesus logically, and as she approaches Jesus logically, he gives her that profound truth. I am the resurrection and the life. But Mary doesn't come that way. Mary comes falling down on her face, a mess, weeping. Some of you would come to Jesus logically, and you would just say, God, help me make sense of this. Because I don't know if I'm mad or sad or whatever, but what I do know is that this doesn't make any sense to me. And you think, and you come to God that way, and that's fine. One of the things I want to caution you in this story is maybe not to contrast Martha and Mary. That's the tendency, right? Because we have Luke chapter 10 where Martha and Mary are contrasted. Jesus comes to them and one's preparing a meal and the other one's sitting at his feet listening to him teach. And the scriptures even tell us that what Mary chose was better, to sit at the feet of Jesus and to learn from him because he wasn't going to be with them forever. And Martha running around doing different things and taking care of business was not the better choice. And so in that story, we get them contrasted, but I want you to be careful because maybe this story is not trying to contrast them. Maybe this story is trying to show us that Jesus is perfectly capable of ministering to both type of responses to suffering and pain. Mary comes emotionally. She's falling down before Jesus. And Jesus' response is that he's deeply moved. Deeply moved and troubled are basically synonyms for each other. Deeply moved just means a strong feeling and emotion. Troubled just means stirred up. How many of you have ever been to a funeral? Okay. How many of you have ever had just bad news that was unexpected? Okay, so you know what this feels like. This stirring up, this troubled. And it's going to happen to him twice, the same way it happens to us twice. Meaning when he gets the news of Lazarus' death and he first talks to the person who's telling him, even though he already knows, when he first sees someone face to face, there's that troubling, that stirring up of emotion. You and I know what this is like. Even if someone calls us and says, so-and-so is dead, we fly halfway across the country, we get there, and we see this person who also loved them, and the emotion hits. We know what that's like. And then it happens all over again when you get to the funeral. Another wave of emotion. The exact same thing's going to happen to Jesus in this story. There's lots of times that people who are driven by emotion get paralyzed by emotion. That's not what happens in this story. Although Jesus is troubled and deeply moved, he's not paralyzed. He says this to Mary in verse 34. Where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. He's not letting emotions paralyze him. He feels it. He knows what it feels like, and yet still moving on. Where have you laid him? I know what I came here to do. And then verse 35, which is probably familiar to you, even if you don't come to church all the time. John 11:35, Jesus wept, which, can I just clarify for a second, is not the shortest verse in the Bible. Okay, can we put that to rest? Can we stop repeating that over and over and over and over? Job 3:2 is a shorter English. He said. Okay, it's shorter in the English. You want shorter in the Greek because you're super technical? Go to 1 Thessalonians 5:16, okay? Less letters. In the English, it's translated rejoice evermore, but in your bulletin, you can see that it's shorter Greek. Okay, so it's not the shortest Greek. It's not the shortest English. So can we stop saying that? If you want to be technical about Jesus wept, this is a seminary in me that's just like, If you want to be technical about what this verse is, it's the shortest complete sentence that's a single verse in the Bible, okay? So just say it accurately. That would just ease my conscience. Jesus wept. Short verse. The shortest English complete sentence. Most accurate. How many of you know what empathy is? How many of you know the difference between empathy and sympathy? Okay, a few of you have watched Brene Brown's video on empathy versus sympathy. How many of you have ever heard of Brene Brown? Okay, I'm going to show you a video here. This is maybe the best description that I could find, shortest, best description of the distinguish between empathy and sympathy. Please do not hear me advocating for Brene Brown or her version of Christianity. Please hear me say that she's a licensed social worker, she's an expert in her field, and she's done a whole bunch of research on empathy and sympathy, and she knows her stuff in this area. So we have to figure out how to learn what truth is and take it from the world and leave the rest. So this is the best way I could give you to describe this. So watch this video real quick.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Huge difference between Jesus giving Mary a whole bunch of words and just crying with her. The difference of drawing her in versus giving her the churchy response about how God's going to make everything better. That is sympathy, but it drives disconnection, because we've all experienced that. Going ahead in John's gospel real quick, John chapter 13. Here's why this is important. Jesus says this, I give a new commandment, to love one another. Just as I have loved you, so also you are to love one another. Everyone will know this, that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So if it's true that Jesus knew how to empathize with Mary, and we're supposed to love each other as Christ loved us, then we have to figure out how to do this. Have to figure out how to connect with the same emotion that the person standing across from us who's suffering is feeling. We have to feel that with them. Why? Because God demonstrated it for us, and then he said, love each other as I loved you. If you want proof that you're a disciple of Jesus, you want proof that you're following him, this is one way that you can think to yourself. I'm learning how to empathize with people. Jesus empathized with people. And that's how I'm choosing to love them, because that's how God has loved me. It's not just for the Christian to figure out. This is not just for the social worker to figure out, or the counselor, or the pastor, or the normal people that we would go to hopefully get some empathy from. This is for all of us to figure out how to do this with each other. I want to share a story before we move on. 2-3 weeks ago, I translated John 11:35. Jesus wept on a Monday. That same week, I had a lady come to me, and she has a proclivity for self-harm. And I got a chance to talk with her. She was sharing how she's stuck in this cycle pattern. And here's the question she asked me when we were sitting there, tears in her eyes. She said, "Do you think God hates me?" And I said, 2 days ago, I translated John chapter 11, verse 35. And the response on the front end doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why would he weep with her? Why wouldn't he just tell her, don't cry, don't be afraid, this is all going to change, it's not going to end this way, you don't have to be afraid? Why wouldn't he just go with that? Why wouldn't he just say, it's going to be okay? Why wouldn't he tell her, it's all going to be over soon? His response on the front end to weep when he knows that he's going to go raise Lazarus from the dead doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why is it that he wasn't angry with her for not understanding? Why is it that he just simply chose to weep with her? So I said, no, I don't think God hates you. What I think is that he feels every ounce of pain and despair and hopelessness and heartache that you feel that would make you do that to yourself. Because what I saw and translated and read was a God who empathizes with those who are suffering. Now, for you nitpickers out there who are saying, whoa, self-harm is somewhat different than losing a loved one, like how can you compare those two? If you haven't yet figured out that people who self-harm experience the same hopelessness and despair and pain and heartache as someone who's just lost a loved one, then you don't understand them at all. No, it's not the same event, but the emotions are very much the same. I said to her, I think that he understands actually you better than anyone else. He may even understand you better than you. He's the only one who knows the full extent, the full weight of everything that you feel. The only one besides you. No matter how good you are at communicating it, how eloquent, he's still the only one who knows truly the depth. And what I want you to see is in the midst of our extreme pain, our extreme suffering, even though he knows the future, even though he can sit and say, look, this isn't the end of your life. You got 50 more years ahead of you. You got 10 more years ahead of you. I got plenty of things for you to do. Even though he knows all those things, that doesn't stop him from sitting with you and saying, I feel what you feel. Giving you exactly what you need every time. Jesus Christ, God, always responds perfectly for what we need. If you're the thinker, if you come to God and you're like, this is a mess, I don't get it, it doesn't make any sense, God, help me to make sense of it, and then you listen for a response in that moment of pain, suffering, he will give you profound truth, same way he gave it to Martha. I am the resurrection and the life. And if you come to Jesus and you're the feeler, you just get overwhelmed by emotions because that's just how you were built. He's not afraid of that either. Because his response is perfect all the time to each person, no matter who you are. Okay, men, look here. Ladies, just sit back in your chair for a second. Men, we cannot fit the stereotype that men are callous and cold and emotionless. Cannot. We have to find a way to break through the mess of culture that tells us that what it means to be a man is to be emotionless and callous and to just get through life and never feel anything. It's not the example that we have. Because Jesus Christ was a man, and he was not emotionless or cold or callous. To the person who came to him and said, I need to figure this out, I need to logic, okay? You and I can go, yes, logic, that's great, let's do that. And we can say, I'll do logic with you. But to the one who comes to us and says, I need you to feel with me, we have to be willing to do that too. When the moment's required for logic, he provided it. For understanding, for profound truth, in the moment when you're trying to make sense of what's going on, he'll give that to you. And in the moment when empathy and feeling and emotion and tenderness is required, he'll give that to you. If you go to him, bowing down before him, saying, I need you. Young men, if you're here and you don't consider yourself an old man, but you just consider yourself young men, listen, the longer you live life, I'm about midway through figuring this out. The longer you live life, the easier it is to become callous. Because you experience the world, and it's a mess. And the safest thing feels like I've been walked out into the world, I've been burned, and so I'm just going to build walls and become callous because it's safer. And that's the danger. The longer you live, the more of the messiness you experience, the danger is to become more callous. But we cannot believe the lie that men should be emotionless or callous. We have to find a way to show healthy emotion to our wives, to our kids. Here's the one that may just absolutely terrify you. If you're thinking to yourself, I do pretty okay with my wife. I do pretty okay with my kids. That took a little learning, but I'm working on it. Here's the one that might just absolutely terrify you. Do you remember that I said that when Martha went and called Mary, Jesus knew that she would come and she would bring a crowd? Which means not only was Jesus empathetic individually with Mary, he was also empathetic in public with the crowd. That's the one that for some of you might be completely terrifying. Because he's not just standing there alone with Mary and Martha, these close friends who he's standing there saying, well, I can weep with them because they know me and they won't judge me and it'll be fine. No. Crowd of people came with them. The text says, when he saw her weeping and when he saw everybody else with her weeping. Public, healthy empathy. This is a huge thing to ask. And yet, we don't really have a choice. Because the command is to love others as Jesus loved us. Have to figure out how to do this. Old guys, if you consider yourself such. The temptation is to become callous. I know some guys that have no problem at all being that cranky old guy who sits out on his porch and yells at the kids who walk on his grass, and they're like, that's all I want to do with my life. I just want to relax, retire, and yell at the kids to get off my grass. I won't tell you who it is because it's somewhat of a close family member. But this callousness should not be the goal of living and experiencing life. It has to be a tenderness. And the older we get, our hearts should become more tender, not less tender. It's tough because I've only lived 30 years, and there are times when I'm thinking to myself, tender sounds terrible right now. Callous sounds great. And that's only 30 years, so give it another 50, and I'll see if I'm still preaching the same message. Hopefully I am, because it's in the text. It's 2 words, but it's powerful. And we need it. Men need it. Women need it. Jesus wept. Last verse we'll cover today, verse 37. There's always a group of people who think too small of who Jesus is. Some of them said this. Sorry, verse 36, I skipped it. Let me read it real quick. Some of them said, so the Jews were saying, see how he loved him. Oh yeah, before we get to verse 37. Ha ha. Notice, men, that when Jesus weeps with them, that people's response is not, would you look at that weak man? Can't even keep himself from crying? That's ridiculous. Notice the response, because I don't think we often think that this is the response we're going to get when we think, should I consider showing emotion publicly in front of other men and or in front of people? I don't think what often goes through our mind is, if I show emotion, people will know how much I love this person. What often goes through is people will think that I'm some kind of just crazy person that can't keep myself together. It's not the response that people had. Just note that. Last verse, verse 37. Some of the people in the crowd said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man also from dying? So if it's true that Jesus Christ always responds perfectly for what we need, if that's true to Martha and to Mary and 2,000 years later to you and I, Jesus Christ always responds perfectly to what we need, then what's fascinating about this statement is that Jesus is doing exactly what the people need in letting Lazarus die instead of what they think they need. Some of you were here on Christmas Eve when I shared how maybe one of the most gracious things that God ever did for humanity was to put us out of the garden. Adam and Eve sinned, and if they would have sinned and then continued to eat of the tree of life, they would have lived forever in their sinless state, and they would have been condemned forever in their sinless state. But instead, God puts them out of the garden, and by doing so, separates himself from us, but also gives us a chance at redemption. Gives us the sentence of death, but then through death redeems us through his son. So the fascinating thing is that the people have not changed thousands of years later. They're still thinking to themselves, what we really need is to be kept from death. What that man needs who's sick is really to be kept from death. But the problem is that was never what we needed. Even since the garden, we didn't need to be kept from death. What we needed to be was resurrected from the dead. And that is completely different. And yet, we still seem to have the same problem in the text. And I think that we still have the same problem today. People are going around saying, how can I live? How can I live? How can I live? When what we really need is to die and be resurrected. It's what we've always needed. When Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. When he says this to Martha and then asks her, do you believe? It's because he's providing exactly, perfectly responding to what you and I need. If think about this for just a second. If he climbs up on a tree and he dies, his death is unjust, right? Because he lived a perfect life, sinless. How could God let a man die who lived a perfect life when death is the punishment for sin? But if he's sinless and he climbs up on a tree and God allows him to die, then it must also be the case that he took someone else's punishment in death. That when he climbed up on the tree, he gave you and I a way to be resurrected. The way that he gave you and I to be resurrected is exactly what he said to Martha. Do you believe? Jesus Christ always responds perfectly for what we need. If you're the thinker and you need profound knowledge in the midst of life and pain and suffering and tragedy, he'll give that to you. If you need empathy in the moment to just sit and cry and weep and not have someone tell you, don't worry, God's working it all out for the good. Jesus knew that. He didn't volunteer that information. Just cried with her. He's willing to do that with you. And when it comes to death and resurrection for the forgiveness of sins, he's willing to do that for you too. And if you believe, you can have the gift that is eternal life. You have to believe in the God who's willing to give you exactly what you need. Pray with me. God, I think that I'm thankful for these words, this text, this story, this demonstration of how perfectly you're orchestrating everything all at the same time. You're ministering to Martha, ministering to Mary, giving the crowds a public sign and declaration of who you are. You're giving profound truth and empathy all at the same time while you're showing signs of who you are and displaying your power and your glory. When we read this whole story all together and we see all the pieces that are happening all at the same time that you're orchestrating, it's mind-blowing. That not only are you working out your glory and your majesty and your salvation and demonstrating that to people, you're also teaching people by what you're doing, and you're empathizing with people and comforting them and teaching all at the same time. God, I don't know how we as believers begin to reflect that level of care for one another. But God, you've commanded in Scripture that we would love one another as you've loved us. So God, first I'm asking that you would show us, each person in this room, the depth of the love that you have for them. So that as we go out into the world and we interact with the world, we interact with each other, our wives, our children, our families, our believing families, our unbelieving families, that we would know exactly the way we're supposed to act, live, think, empathize, feel, because we've been given such a clear picture of who you are and how you minister to us. So God, I'm asking that you would draw near to us, teach us, show us who you are, and then give us the strength, the power to go to other people, to the rest of the world, and be transformed and live the same way, so that when they see us demonstrate something that makes no sense to them, we can point them back to you and say, the only reason that I love you this way is because God loved me this way. And there's no other explanation for it. So God, change us, transform us, speak to us, reveal yourself to us, we pray. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.